In this chapter, we will look at styling end hair. But before we go too deeply into the features for styling end hair, I want to talk about production quality. So far in the course, we've used pretty modest settings for the hair. But if we want it to look really good in a rendering, then we will need to be a bit more aggressive about those settings. So I want to walk you through the process of what I've done to achieve this level of production quality. First of all, the style that I've chosen here is a short hairstyle. And because of that, we need to be ultra careful about collisions. When we initially created the scalp emitter mesh, we made it a little bit smaller than the character head. I just want to show you that I've adjusted that so that there's almost no gap between the emission mesh and the collision mesh. And that's important because if there was a large gap there, then the hairs might collide and or get stuck between the two surfaces. I'll hide the strokes layer and select the scalp. I'll make sure I unreference that. Get in really close so you can see that they're almost right on top of each other. There's only like a millimeter difference in size between the scalp emission object and the head collision object. If the hair were longer, it would be less of an issue, but because it's a very short hairstyle, there's very little room for error there. Okay, so that's one thing we need to look at. The next thing is just the density of follicles. Let me unhide the follicles and the output curves so that we can see that there are a lot more of them than in previous movies. The reason that I created more follicles is because I wanted smaller clumps, and that way I could get better production quality. And if I have smaller clumps, then I need to have more follicles. And what I did was I painted these follicles and I used a pretty high setting. Let's go in and take a look at that under End Hair, Paint Hair Follicles options. I set the follicle density in U and V to 65. Previously, we had values of 40 or 50, and that was good enough for demonstration purposes, but for production, you're going to need to have a higher density. Another thing that I did here was I created more graduations in the length of the hairs. In the previous demo, I had some hairs that were 2 centimeters, some that were 1.5, 1, and so on. Here, I just have more gradation in the lengths of hairs. I have some that are 2 centimeters, some that are 1.75, 1.5, 1.25, and so on. Just feathering the hair at lengths of 1/4 of a centimeter at a time. And I drew smaller brush strokes with the artisan tool here, with a smaller brush radius so that I could control the length of the hair better. Okay, so that's how we got to this point. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how to randomize the follicles, because when you use the Paint Hair Follicles tool, they will be built in a grid. And we need to break that up, especially when you've got very short hairs. So in this area here with very short hairs, if we rendered this now, we might see a visible line where all the follicles are sort of lining up. So we just need to randomize them. I'm going to go ahead and hide everything except for the follicles. And I will select those follicles. Go ahead and drag a big rectangle around all of those. And then go into the End Hair menu and choose Randomize Follicles Options. Now I've got a value here set at 0.01, but the default is actually 0.05. And in this case, that would cause the follicles to move too much. So I want a low value here, a range of 0.01. Click Randomize. And there you see now they've been scattered around and we don't have that grid pattern. So that's going to look much better in our rendering. All right, cool. And then the last things I want to show you are going to be in the hair system shape node. So I want to select the strokes and then go into the attribute editor. Control A, hair system shape. And the first thing I want to talk about is the hairs per clump and the subsegments. Let me copy this tab off just so that we can see this without having the object selected. And I'll go into the clump and hair shape, and we've got hairs per clump and subsegments. Currently, there are no subsegments, but for good renders, I will need a subsegments value of, let's say, 2. And I also want to have more hairs per clump so that I don't have any areas where there are gaps. So I'll set the hairs per clump up to 20. And as soon as I did that, it looked like some of the hair strokes disappeared. We've still got follicles, we've still got output curves, but the actual strokes seem to have disappeared. Well, this is not a problem, and in fact, it will still render just fine. It's just that we're only able to see a certain number of paint effect strokes on this object at any one time, and we've exceeded that limit. So that we're not distracted by this and we don't have a false impression of where the hair is going to be, all we need to do is just reduce the display quality. I can bring that down to about 1/3, and that will be fine. Now, we don't have as dense of hair strokes, but they will render just as dense. And now we won't have any issues with display. Okay, cool. Now, the last thing that I want to show you here has to do with collisions. Let me hide the follicles so that we're not distracted by that, and also hide the output curves. And so we're just seeing the strokes only. Scroll down into the collisions section and open that up. And you can go to solver display and turn on collision thickness. And what we see here now is that the clumps have a certain width, and because we have so many clumps and they are pretty wide, they're actually overlapping. And the clumps are actually colliding with one another. And this is bad for two reasons. One is the clumps are so thick that they might have collision issues with the head. And two, the clumps may have issues colliding with one another if you happen to turn on self-collide. And ironically, even if you have self-collide turned off, having clumps that overlap like this will negatively impact the simulation performance. So what can we do here? We have an attribute called collide width offset, and that lets us make the clumps larger or smaller for the purposes of collision. If we give it a negative value, then the collision envelope will be smaller for each clump. I've experimented with this already, and I found that values around a negative 0.25 worked well in this particular scene. So I'll put in a negative 0.25, and I'll need to rewind and play back, and it'll take a moment for it to update. But now you can see that the hairs are much smaller for the purposes of collision, and they're not overlapping. I could even bring this down a little bit further if I was really concerned about especially those very short, small hairs. I maybe could bring this down even further to like a negative 0.28 and rewind and play back. And remember that it takes a moment for the simulation to update. All right, cool. So that is dealing with the collisions pretty well. And those are just the things that we need to think about when we want to set up a hair simulation for a TrueBlue production rendering. I'll turn the collision thickness display back off again.